I live in a city, but a while back, my wife and I bought 6 acres out in the boonies, and we go out there camping. It's great. But I've made trails around the property so I could see what's there because it's most of it is like three-fourths of it is forested, and then there's an open meadow. But I've gone through and looked at things, and there's blackberries growing, Himalayan blackberries, which you see growing everywhere on the sides of roads and stuff around here anyway. This is Washington State. And I already knew before we even bought the property that blackberries were considered an invasive species. I didn't know we had any on our property, but once I started wandering around, I realized we actually have quite a bit of it growing there. And I was automatically against it. It's an invasive species after all. It doesn't belong here. But we've had the property now 6 years, and we go out there every summer and all the way into, we camp out there all the way into October, sometimes even November. And so I've seen the life cycle of these blackberry bushes. Blackberry vines really is what they are, but they kind of like grow in a glom. So it's kind of sort of like a bush, like a briar patch, basically. And I've noticed that the bees love them. They flower a lot, and they're sometimes just completely covered with bees. And the birds love the berries. That's part of how they spread, is the birds just scarf up the berries. I love the berries. The berries are great. I can understand why they've ended up this one kind of blackberry, Himalayan blackberries have spread all over the world because people plant them. They make such good, big, juicy, delicious berries that people plant them, but then once they plant them, they start to really take over. They're extremely successful as a species. And rabbits love them. They love having a place that they can go into that other animals don't want to go into, so a briar patch. Deers love them, actually. Deer eat did I say deers? I mean, deer eat the new sprouts when they first start shooting up. The ends of them don't have, because these things have pretty good size thorns on them, and the deer don't eat them. It doesn't seem like anything really eats them once they have the thorns. But when the top part of the shoot, when it's first coming out, doesn't have the thorns, or it has thorns, but they're really soft. And deer just walk by and eat the tops of these things. So the deer love them, and humans love them. So they're actually serving the natural community. The reason that they're labeled invasive because they're so much more successful than native plants. They take over. They shade out the other plants that would normally be growing there, and they die out. And these vines take over. They call them canes, the blackberry canes, and they grow out like the first year they just send up a shoot, usually straight up, and then it eventually falls over. After it gets 8 feet tall or 20 feet tall or however long, and then it starts to fall over. And if it's on top of something else, it'll fall over on top of it, like a tree or a small bush or something. And then the next year it grows side branches and then flowers and fruits. That's the life of one cane. But this plant is impressive. I've come to change my mind about it. I know it's still an invasive and it hasn't naturally grown there. It's come here from somewhere else. But the bees love it. All these animals love it, and I love it. And I actually use the plant because it produces so much plant material per square foot. Like, it grows really fast. It's amazing. I've tried to find online, or a book about it or something, somebody that studied how this plant has become so amazingly successful. I posited at one time, I was like, wherever they grow naturally, there must be an animal that eats the heck out of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't evolve to be so prolific. And then I find out it's not actually from the Himalayas. It's originally from northern Persia or northern Iran. And one of the native animals there is goats, and goats love blackberries. You can look on YouTube and watch just goats eating blackberries. They love them, and they don't mind. They actually do eat the thorns. A friend of mine, his daughter was in the 4-H, and she was raising goats, and they had a pen that they put the goats in, and they could move this pen around to different parts of their property. and they moved it over a blackberry bush and a blackberry, clump, briar patch. And those goats ate it down to the ground. They ate every last little bit of it. So if goats and blackberry vines have evolved in the same place, you can see why why the blackberry vines would be so vigorous. Because if they weren't, they wouldn't survive around goats. When I decide on a podcast to do, I try to decide on something that I really am interested in at this very moment. And just last week, I was trying to find what adaptations blackberry vines have that make them so successful. Somebody had told me that they have bladders underneath the ground that hold water, and I couldn't find anything about that, but they must, because they really grow a lot long after the rain stops. And like everything else is kind of petering out, and these things are just taken off. So they must have some way of holding water. But whatever, one of their adaptations obviously is the thorns. That helps them. So it keeps things from, except for goats, keeps other animals from eating too much of them. One of their adaptations is that their berries are so delicious, and there's a little seed inside each one of those little balls of deliciousness. So birds spread it really easily, humans spread it really easily, and want to plant it in other places. So that's part of what makes it so successful is that it produces a really delicious berry. I thought, though, that somebody would have studied these just out of pure impressiveness. But when I was looking for what there is about them, it was all bad. It was all, these are invasive and they take over, and here's how to get rid of them. But there's kind of a movement, or at least there's a whole bunch of books that are about a different way of looking at invasive species. First of all, almost all weeds are really good survivors. They are very well adapted to multiple conditions and can survive better than most of that's how it becomes an invasive species. It's surviving better in the conditions that the native species have evolved for. These intruders come and survive in those conditions better than the native ones. That's what makes it invasive. But at the same time, that's kind of what makes these plants impressive. Dandelions, for example, I don't think they're native at all to North America, but they're everywhere. And I think they're actually everywhere in the world. And they're an incredibly successful species that grows in places that other plants can't. And they are useful. A lot of these invasive species or weeds are actually useful medicinal plants. Dandelion root is used as a medicinal. They make tea out of it. Dandelion leaves are extremely nutritious. Dandelion roots go really deep. They can penetrate into really hard soil and can help break it up and make it possible for other plants to grow in that soil once the dandelions have broken up the soil a little bit. Same with blackberries. They can grow in places that other plants can't grow, and they produce delicious berries. The leaves are actually, you can take blackberry leaves and dry them and make tea out of them, and it has all the polyphenols and good stuff that you can get out of green tea. Green tea is really good for you. Well, blackberry leaves have all of that good stuff too, except for no caffeine. The berries are really high in anthocyanins and fairly low in carbs. They don't really need fertilizer. They don't need any coddling, extra water, nothing. They're amazing. Blackberry vines can spread by seeds, but they can also spread by roots, which is another really successful way to spread. Kind of like bamboo does. It sends these rhizomes underneath the ground and then pops up another one some distance from it. And it can, because it's sending a root out, it's got kind of the backup or the extra nutrition that's already being held in reserve by the original plant. So it's sending up a new plant, but it's not starting from scratch, so it can grow really fast. And because blackberry vines kind of shoot straight up in the air and then fall over, they can almost climb trees. The thorns become like grappling hooks, and they sort of go up and then fall over. And so for short trees, they can actually bury the tree. It's also like Medusa. If you cut off the tops, how I said the deer eat the tops of the vine? once they do, two vines come out the end. And they're incredibly prolific. They produce a lot of berries. They turn a lot of the sunshine falling on that square acres or whatever, square feet. They turn a lot of that sunshine into food. Now, do we make up our mind about this plant? Is it bad or good? Should we pick a side on this? Or should this remain complex and undecided? I have the same ambiguous feeling about the black locust tree, which we have several of those growing on our property. They are fast growing. They tolerate drought really well. They allow other plants to grow in their shade. The permaculture people use these because they're also nitrogen fixing. So they, in a sense, fertilize the soil. They, a lot of plants can't make their own nitrogen. Bacteria was what makes the nitrogen. Basically, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air, but the plants can't access it. It requires some other process, like a bacteria that can convert the nitrogen that's in the air into a form that's usable by a plant. So nitrogen fixing plants usually have some kind of symbiotic relationship with the bacteria and form little nodules on their roots that protect the bacteria, and then the bacteria feeds the plant nitrogen and the plant feeds the bacteria sugars, and so they benefit each other that way. Anyway, so it's nitrogen fixing. It produces, when it drops its leaves in the fall, those leaves contain a lot of nitrogen, so they feed the things around them. They're kind of they form dappled shade. It's not really heavy shade, so a lot of things can grow beneath them and are not killed off by the intense sunlight, but have enough sunlight to grow. So in a way, it's kind of a beneficial plant. It produces a very, very hard wood that is resistant to rot. So they can use this wood for, fence posts and stuff like that. They can hammer it into the ground and it won't rot very, very quickly. So anyway, it's a useful plant, helpful in a lot of different ways. It's one of the principles of permaculture is that they try to have plants that have multiple uses. And black locusts are like that. They're also coppicable, which means you can cut it off and it'll grow more. Like you can cut it down to a stump and it'll just grow some more, which makes it partly bad. If you think of it as an invasive species, and a lot of places do think of black locust as an invasive species, it's a bad thing because even though you cut it down, it still keeps growing. But if you want it to keep growing, but you don't want it to get too big, you have that option. You can just cut it down and it'll just grow some more. It'll start over again. Anyway, same thing. It's kind of ambiguous. Is this a bad plant? Is this a good plant? It's beneficial in a lot of ways. It also, black locusts produce flowers, and apparently the honey that comes from these flowers, the flowers smell really good. They're in the pea family. This is a tree that's in the pea family. So they have their flowers kind of look like little pea flowers, and bees love them. And it produces a really good tasting honey. And because it's so prolific and it grows so well, some cattle farmers let the cows eat these trees or cut branches off and let the cows eat it because it's really, anything that's high in nitrogen is high in protein. So, because it's a nitrogen fixing plant, its leaves are high in nitrogen, so high in protein. So it's a good food. It's a good fodder for cattle, helps them grow better. When we come back, we'll talk more about this. And now, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Anchor, which is a platform that allows you to make podcasts, and it's what I'm using right now. It's really easy to use. It's free. It's got editing tools. They help you distribute the podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and so on. And they make it easy to make money on your podcast by making it possible for you to add ads. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started. It's interesting because many plants that are native are weak and delicate. On our property, we're in an area where the Oregon white oak grows naturally. We don't have any on our property, and I wanted some. So I went and I got some, bare root white oak plants and planted them out there. A couple of times I've done this, planted several at a time, and none of them made it. they, even though they're native, they're kind of delicate, hard to get established. And then there's these non-native plants thriving. I have kind of collect pictures of plants pushing up through asphalt. It's just it's incredible to me that a dandelion, a delicate little dandelion, can push itself up through asphalt. These are not weak plants. These are incredibly resilient, amazing plants. Weeds. In fact, they're weeds because they're so resilient. They can outcompete other plants. Remember, I told you that I'd come across books lately that were about invasive species. One of them is called The New Wild: Why Invasive Species Will Be Nature's Salvation. Another one is called Beyond the War on Invasive Species: A Permaculture Approach to Ecosystem Restoration. Another one is called Invasive Plant Medicine: The Ecological Benefits and Healing Abilities of Invasives. And the authors writing these books are not necessarily in favor of anybody going out and planting invasive species, although some of them are. Because, like, for example, in permaculture, they do plant things like black locust trees because they're so useful, even though they're planting them in an area that they don't naturally belong. But some of them are just accepting the fact that these invasives are here, and that there may be other ways of dealing with this rather than the kind of standard approach is you go spray toxins all over these plants trying to kill them off, usually ineffectively. That there's a better way to deal with it. There's other books that are kind of like, how, let's eat the invasives. If we were eating all the fruits of the blackberries, there would be fewer that the birds would get to and spread them. Right? Or if people were eating more of these plants, they would die off. It would be better than just spraying them with poison, because that's going to kill other things too, like birds and earthworms and whatever. Another book is called Weeds: In Defense of Nature's Most Unloved Plants. I think that's the book that talked about how a lot of weeds have grown up. I mean, since the beginning of agriculture, there have been problems with weeds, obviously. And some plants have adapted so that they look like the plant. For example, I think there was a plant that originally did not look like wheat, but it tends to grow in wheat fields. And so it started looking more and more like wheat because, of course, if there's people going through the fields trying to find the weeds and pull them out, the closer they can look to wheat, the less likely they are to be pulled out. So they slowly have evolved to look like wheat and sometimes behave like wheat. And other plants have done this too, where they've evolved to mimic the plants that they grow with. But whether we like them or hate them, invasive species are all over the world. And the more people move around, the more mixed up these plants will get, and the fewer of them will be on their original continent. I don't know if it's possible to stop it. I know that there are efforts all over the world to try to kill off invading species. I think probably you would have a good chance if you got it right at the beginning. But once it really, they call it naturalizing, where it becomes part of the landscape. Once it gets to that point, I don't know if you can get rid of it without causing more destruction than the invasive weed itself is causing. I don't know what the solution is. And a lot of people, even people that are experts on this and working on it, don't really know what the solution is. But I think it's fascinating how successful these plants are. And for sure, they should be studied as amazing examples of successful species. And my view on them has changed since I got this property and started looking at them and watching how many animals use these plants. And now I do too. I love that time of year. It's right around my wife's birthday. They start to really fruit, and we always get big harvests out there. And we're starting to learn how to use it, how to keep the vines from taking over, prune them down so they're sort of manageable and easily accessible when they do fruit. And I've stopped trying to kill them all off, and I'm learning to live with them and let the other animals have a go at them too. And I've really only been discussing plants, invasive plants, but obviously there are invasive animals that may be even worse in their destruction. I've been watching I've seen videos of what has happened in Australia. They had rabbits really take over, and they built this fence all the way across their country to stop the rabbits, and it didn't work. Then they introduced bacteria that would kill these rabbits, and it didn't kill them all off. And the ones that it didn't kill off had a kind of resistance to this bacteria, and so then they started spreading. And this is, and they've introduced other animals into other places. Even Australia is another one. They have now wild goats, and goats can be really destructive. And so then they have these wild herds, and then there are people that round them up and harvest them for meat. And in North America, we've got wild pigs in a lot of areas, especially in the South. And some people hunt them and eat them, but they can be really destructive to farmland. But at the same time, they are apparently delicious. One of the things I've started doing out at my property, kind of a little microcosm, is trying to think of whatever's there as a resource. Is there something I can use it for? One of the principles in permaculture is called chop and drop, where you take just organic material, leaves of something, you prune something, take those leaves and put it around another plant as a kind of fertilizer and mulch. So we do that also there, because there's some places on property that are really in the baking sun, and I'm trying to get fruit trees growing there and stuff like that. So one of the things I've done to help them out is I'll take blackberry vines where I don't want them, chop them up and put them around a fruit tree, for example. And it helps that fruit tree. It gives it some mulch, so it keeps it from drying out too much, cools the roots a little bit, but it also breaks down into nutrition that the fruit tree can use. So it is a resource. Now I'm using it as a resource and controlling it to some degree. And that may be a really good approach for us all over the world, is where something is really well established. For example, if you have wild pigs, have open season, and I think they do in most places, have open season on those, and let the hunters go crazy and get as many as they can, keeping the population of them down. And if it happens that they hunt them into extinction, so be it. They shouldn't be there anyway, right? So same thing with an invasive plant. If it doesn't belong there, but you find a way to really use it, and you use it so much you kill it off in that area, so be it. It shouldn't belong there anyway. But if not, you're utilizing the resource for something good. So what do you think? What do you think about invasive species? What do you think we ought to do about it? I'm curious. Some of these writers writing about using what is known as invasive species for agriculture or to grow food or for other things, some of them have this point of view that the climate is changing, and some of these invasives or aliens, some of them call them aliens, are better adapted to hard, dry soil than the ones that are native to that area. And it may be that we're going to have to use some of these aliens because they can produce food, or they can produce a ground cover, or they can prevent erosion better than the native species. So that's another point of view. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.